So today we're going to do the presentation VJ Day Victory over Japan, which we celebrate on August 15th. I'm going to start by covering the events that precede VJ Day, and that would include Pearl Harbor, the architect of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, the US #1 POW, the Janesville 99, a tank company out of Janesville, Wisconsin, the nuclear bombs Little Boy and Fat Man, which lead directly to the surrender of Japan on August 15th, and the worldwide celebration, including the infamous The Kiss in Times Square of New York, and some other interesting sidelights regarding the Pacific War during World War II. I'd like to start by honoring Von Drake. Supposedly there are only 12 known survivors of Pearl Harbor, and he was thought to be the last American survivor. On the day of the attack, he was 23 years old. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was preparing to go to breakfast when he began to hear the bombs dropping, and he thought it was nothing more than a training session until he went outside and saw the Japanese planes flying overhead. He will survive that attack. He will go on and fight the war, and he passed away on April 7th of 2025 at the age of 101. I'd like to introduce to you Lois Tomto. I had the privilege of talking to Lois. She's a resident of the Renaissance Senior Living in Madison, Wisconsin. And Lois shared her story with me. She was not at Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack, but she's about as close as you could get. She was a 13-year-old resident of Oahu, and she lived in a short distance from Pearl Harbor. You can see here Lois, and she's proud of her needlepoint here, which this is Diamond Head in Oahu. I didn't know, I thought Diamond Head was nothing more than a tourist attraction, but it actually was a very large military base. And she lived about a mile away from there. And she lived approximately 6 miles from Pearl Harbor. And she said on the day of the attack, they could see the billowing smoke from the burning ships and planes and buildings. She said following that attack, they were on high alert because they were expecting a land assault to follow that air attack. Of course, that never happened. She would go on to share more information about her time during that Pearl Harbor attack. She told me one thing that was different than here in the States. In the States, we had internment camps where Japanese families were interned for the duration of the war. She said in Oahu, she said after the Pearl Harbor attack, they will take a census of the Hawaiian Islands, and approximately 1/3 of that population will be Japanese. She said they were our friends. We grew up with them, we went to school with them, and they were never interned in Hawaii. These are the world leaders during World War II. We have Adolf Hitler, who commits suicide on April 30th of 1945. Benito Mussolini, who along with his mistress are killed by partisans on April 28th of 1945. We have the Japanese Emperor, Hirohito. We have the Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, the English Premier, Winston Churchill, and US President Franklin Roosevelt. He will be our 32nd president, and this will be his 4th term, the only president who have ever served 4 terms. He doesn't quite make it to the end of the war, and he dies on April 12th of 1945. And then up comes his vice president to become President Harry Truman. Emperor Hirohito is born on April 29th, 1901 in Tokyo. In 1924, he marries Princess Nagako Kuni. On December 25th, 1926, he becomes the 124th Emperor of Japan at the age of 25. He will serve as emperor from 1926 to 1989, making him the longest serving emperor of Japan. In 1940, he will sign the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy to form the Axis. In my remembrance of history when I was in school, the Axis always referred to me as Germany and Italy. I never really associated Japan with that. But Japan and Germany will have a very close tie during World War II. On August 15th of 1945, they will play a recorded message of Hirohito surrendering at the end of the war. General McCarthy is the overlord overseeing the reestablishment of Tokyo and Japan. Many people think that Hirohito should be charged with war crimes, and General McCarthy will charge 28 Japanese military leaders with war crimes, but he will not charge Hirohito with war crimes. The emperor is looked upon by the citizens of Japan as a deity or divine. And McCarthy is worried that if he charges him with war crimes, it will create instability and chaos. So he leaves him in his position as emperor. He also wants somebody who will work with him to establish a new government, and Hirohito has agreed to do that. And in 1947, they will form a constitutional monarchy where the parliament will run the affairs of the government and the emperor will simply serve as a figurehead, much like the British monarchy. He will become the first emperor to tour Europe in 1971, and he will be the first emperor to come to the US, where he will meet President Richard Nixon, and he will go on a tour of Disneyland. He will die on January 7th, 1989 at the age of 88. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Isoroku in Japanese means 56, and he's named this because when he is born, his father was 56 years old. Admiral Yamamoto is the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and on the day of the attack, December 7th of 1941, he will be present during that attack, but he will not be the commander and the director of the attack. That privilege is given to Vice Admiral Nagumo, and he receives this privilege because of his loyalty to Yamamoto. Nagumo has never been the captain of an aircraft carrier, nor of a fleet this large. Yamamoto will be present, and he'll be the commander of this aircraft carrier called the Agagi, which will carry 86 aircraft. The attack fleet will leave Japan in November, late November, and they will travel 3,500 miles to the island Oahu undetected. And in that fleet, there will be 67 ships, including 6 aircraft carriers. This will be the largest number of aircraft carriers ever used in a single attack. The US and the British forces may often use 1 or 2 to support an attack, but they would never have used 6. In addition, these 6 aircraft carriers will carry 353 airplanes. There will be 5 mini-subs in this fleet. They approach Oahu, and they are now 230 miles offshore. Now we'll look at the timeline of the attack. At 6:10 a.m., the first fleet of 188 airplanes will launch from those 6 aircraft carriers heading for Oahu. At 6:45, the USS Ward destroyer will spot a mini-sub and fire off shots at the conning tower and set off depth charges and sink that mini-sub. These will be the first shots fired by the US in World War II. At 7, they will then relay the message of this attack to the base in Pearl Harbor. There's a delay getting that message and trying to decode the message. The supervisor who gets the message does not notify the base because he wants to make sure and confirm this attack before he announces anything to the base. At 7:40 a.m., the first wave of planes approaches Oahu. At 7:49, the flight commander gives the order to attack, and at 7:55 a.m., the attack begins on Pearl Harbor. At 8:10 a.m., the SS Arizona will take 4 direct hits and explode and sink. At 8:17 a.m., the USS Helm will again spot a mini sub, fire its conning tower, and set off depth charges. At 8:54, the second wave of planes, 167, will approach Oahu. And at 10 a.m., the last of the planes are leaving the attack and heading back to the aircraft carriers. If we look at this map on the left, the first wave of planes is coming from the north and the west. Their target will be the airports to destroy or damage as many airplanes as they can, and the battleships in Pearl Harbor. The second wave, again, will come from the north and the east. And again, they will attack the airfields and the ships in Pearl Harbor. If we look at this map here, you can see the ships here lined up. This is called Battleship Row. You can see that Japan had quite a detailed layout and map of where these ships were going to be located in the harbor. The ships in yellow are the battleships that were damaged. The ones in red are the ones that were sunk. The primary target that Yamamoto was aiming at were the airports to eliminate any planes, or as many planes as possible, to limit a counterattack, and then the battleships in Pearl Harbor. The battleships are the largest ships that the U.S. Navy has. And he attacks these large battleships in order to attempt to destroy them or sink them, to show that as powerful and mighty as the U.S. is, Japan is not afraid to take on that battle. As a result of the attack, the U.S. will suffer 21 ships, either sunk or damaged. Of the 8 battleships there, all of them will be damaged, 4 of them will be sunk. 188 airplanes will be destroyed, 157 will be damaged. 2,404 Americans will lose their lives, including 68 civilians killed and 34 injured. And there'll be 1,178 Americans injured. What about Japan? What are their losses? They will lose 29 airplanes and they will have 74 damaged. They will lose all 5 of their mini-subs and they will have 130 men killed. None of their ships will be damaged, and in fact, none of them will ever even be attacked. And they will all return safely to Japan. Well, the next day, the headlines throughout the world scream the announcement of this attack on Pearl Harbor and that the U.S. has now declared war against Japan. Many people will ask, should we have known that this attack was coming on Pearl Harbor? Some will argue that we should have known. Others will say we were totally caught off guard. Prior to the attack, the U.S. is pretty much wrapping up the war against Germany in May of 1945. The U.S. and Japan have been trying to work out a treaty, and they cannot reach an agreement. I think part of the problem was miscommunication between the two countries. Japan relies heavily on import of oil sources, as they do not have much of their own. The U.S. will then put on a blockade around the island, blocking off their source of oil. Japan will feel they have no choice but to go to war. General McCarthy has warned the Army and the Navy commander at Pearl Harbor that they should be on alert for an attack, and they go on high alert. But nothing happens, and they canceled that alert on December 6th, the day before the attack, and they released those officers and sailors, and many of them are not even at their station at the time of the attack. On December 6th, they intercept a coded message from the Japanese asking about location of the ships within the harbor, but they just take that as routine communication, and they take no actions. At 3:42 a.m., the USS Condor is coming into the harbor, and they report that they have seen the telescope of a submarine outside of the harbor. The commanders will send out ships looking for this submarine. They will not find it, and they assume it is just a hoax. At 6:45, we had the USS Ward firing on the mini-sub and making the announcement to the base that they receive at 6:53. No action is taken on that announcement. Perhaps this was the biggest tip-off that should have warned them that this attack was coming. At 7:02 a.m., a radar operator reports to a supervisor seeing a large number of planes approaching Oahu from the north. There's a delay in him getting this and acting on it. At 7:20, he tells the operators, don't worry about it. We are expecting a flight of 12 B-17s from California, and that is probably what you are seeing. And indeed, there were 12 B-17s coming, and they literally flew into the attack. But they did not have their 50 caliber guns loaded and could not mount a counterattack. 10 of those B-17s will land safely, but by the time they get their guns loaded and they're ready to mount a counterattack, the attack on Pearl Harbor is over. What they also failed to tell their supervisor was they assumed that they said they had seen as many as 50 planes approaching Oahu from the north. It was actually 188. Normal procedure in war is when a country is going to do an attack, they will notify the opposition of that attack in advance to give them some warning, and maybe in order to give them a little time to prepare for that attack. The Japanese military leaders cannot agree amongst themselves whether they should give this warning or not. And by the time they decide, okay, we will go ahead and send the warning, and they send it to the diplomat in Washington, D.C., and he gets that message to President Roosevelt, the attack has already been underway for 20 minutes. And as I mentioned, I just recently started reading a book that the U.S. had cracked both the German and Japanese codes. And they did this early in the war. And it turns out that we actually had coded messages from the Japanese telling about the attack on Pearl Harbor. But our military sources of decoding was quite small and not developed. In one case, they only had one individual who could read these codes and decode them. And so no action was taken prior to the attack. They did go back and look at those after the attack and then realized that they should have seen that in the coded messages, but they were not up and running efficiently. And it would take them some time to do that, get the decoders up and the system working and coordinating between the political and the military. And it's in this book that I now realize the close relationship that there was between Japan and Germany. They would try to work in coordinating attacks on even Italy later in the war, where they could both get together and attack. And all of this plays a role in terms of what happens between Germany and Russia and the US in terms of how they approach the counterattacks during the war. It gets quite complicated. Well, was this attack a success or was it a failure? For Japan, it was an immediate success. People ask me, what did it mean when the Japanese flight commander yelled, "Tora, Tora, Tora," following the attack? Tora in Japanese means tiger. And this was the code that the flight commander gave after the attack to the commander overseeing the attack, that the attack was successful and the Americans were caught totally off guard. The Americans would suffer the loss of 21 ships, all 4 battleships being damaged, 4 being sunk, and they will suffer little loss themselves, losing only 29 planes and 130 men, and no damage to any of the ships in the fleet. But it will turn out to be a failure. The first 2 attacks, waves of attacks, again, remember, attacked the airfields and the battleships. There was supposed to be a 3rd wave. The 3rd wave was to go after the infrastructure of the harbor. There were huge oil reserves here, as this was the oil reserves for all of the ships in the Pacific. They did not attack those at all because they did not do this third wave, nor did they hit other critical infrastructure, such as the ship and submarine dry docks, which remained essentially intact. And because of that, they were able to get the ships all up and operational in a short time. They were able to raise all of the sunken ships except for 2 and get them back into service. Yamamoto also had an expectation that there would be 3 aircraft carriers here, and they were planned to be attacked. It turns out that one of those aircraft carriers was still in San Diego, undergoing repairs and restocking, and was soon to be heading for Oahu. The other 2 aircraft carriers that would have been docked just outside the harbor were out delivering aircraft to other islands, and they were not present during the attack. The plan was to attack these aircraft carriers to either slow down or eliminate the possibility of the US approaching Japan and attacking by air. So indeed they won the battle, but they will end up losing the war. Prior to the attack, Yamamoto says this attack on Pearl Harbor will determine not only the fate of the war, but the fate of Japan. And he is quoted as saying, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And indeed they did. The US was able to restore that entire harbor and the ships in a matter of 6 months. And they would then attack Japan with a revenge. Ensign Sakamaki, he's one of 10 Japanese naval officers selected to do a suicide mission on the attack of Pearl Harbor in 5 two-man mini-subs, which would each carry only 2 torpedoes. Their mission is to enter the harbor, fire their torpedoes and sink a ship, and hopefully return to their mother sub. Sakamaki's mini-sub has problems from the minute it is launched, since his gyro compass does not work, and he ends up 10 miles off course. He gets back on course, but now he must operate at surface level because his compass is not working. He is spotted by the USS Helm that fires at the conning tower and sets off depth charges, literally blowing his sub out of the water onto a coral reef. He will attempt to sabotage that submarine with explosives. They fail to go off. His crewmate will be carried out to sea and will drown. When they recover his submarine, inside they will find a map showing the location of all the ships within Pearl Harbor. The next morning, Sergeant Akui, on December 8th of 1941, while on beach patrol, will find an unconscious Sakamaki laying on the beach. He will capture Sakamaki, and Sakamaki becomes US POW No. 1. He is sent to the US, and on March 9th, 1942, he arrives here in Wisconsin at Camp McCoy, where he will spend the remainder of the war as a POW. When he's captured, he asks for the officer to shoot and kill him so he can honor the battlefield conduct code for the Japanese, which said you will fight to the death. Of course, they don't shoot him. He asks them, can he commit suicide? And they do not, of course, allow him to do that. But he will attempt suicide 4 times while in captivity. On the day of the attack, he's 23 years old. He will fight in the war 1 day. Following his release as a POW, he will become a pacifist, as does Japan. He will learn English while he's in captivity. He will be released in January of 1946 and repatriated. He will marry. When he gets home, he will receive hate mail, that he is an embarrassment and he did not honor that code of conduct. And they will demand a public apology and even that he commit suicide. He will marry 1 year after the war is ended on August 15, 1946, and he will have 2 children. In 1949, he will write his memoirs, I Attacked Pearl Harbor, in which he talks about the attack on Pearl Harbor, his time as a captive and a POW, and his life following the war. He will then become an executive for Toyota Motors in Japan, And in 1969, he will be the Toyota President of Operations in Brazil. In 1983, he will return to Toyota. He will retire in 1989, and he will die on November 29, 1991, at the age of 81. I'm sorry, 1999. Now, remember, he attacks Pearl Harbor in his mini-sub in 1941. In 1991, he will attend a conference on the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. And this will be the first time he will see his mini-sub that he attacked Pearl Harbor in 50 years. Now, I don't know how tall he is. He's 73 here. And you try to imagine standing in this mini-sub. About the only place you could stand would be where the conning tower is. And there are 2 men in this submarine. These were referred to as coffin submarines. And indeed, they would turn out to be that way, as 9 of the 10 officers will be killed in that attack, and 4 of those 5 mini-subs will be sunk. Here's Sakamaki and the 10 officers that were in those mini-subs. Here's Sakamaki. They'll do a painting to posthumously honor those officers that were in those mini-subs. And you will note that Sakamaki is missing from that painting. It was assumed that he died in the attack along with the other 9 officers. When they found out he was still alive, they will report him as missing in action, and they will tell his family they are not to tell anybody that he survived, as it would be a dishonor to Sakamaki and to the family and to Japan. In 1921, they will build a new memorial, and they will do another painting to posthumously honor these 10 naval officers, and Sakamaki will be included in that painting. Well, here's to give you some idea of the size of the subs, 78 feet long compared to that of a normal submarine that would be in operation at that time. His sub is brought to the US in an effort to raise war bonds. It'll travel through 41 states and 2,200 cities and villages in that effort. Here is President Roosevelt observing the submarine. I assume it's here in Washington, D.C. Well, war bonds have been around since the Civil War. And during World War II, they will have 8 war bond drives going from February of 1942 to December of 1945. President Roosevelt will buy the very first war bond. The war bonds will be promoted via movies, celebrities, in the media, and work. The most common bought war bond is the $25 war bond that would cost you $18.75. But you could buy them in denominations of anywhere from $25 to $10,000. Children could participate by buying war bond stamps for 10 cents and collect them until they had enough to purchase a war bond. You would pay 75% of the face value of that bond. It would mature over 10 years at a rate of 2.9%. In a football game on December 7th of 1942 between UCLA and USC, a war bond drive run by students will raise $2 million. At that time, we have 134 million civilians in the US. 85 million will buy war bonds. Those 8 war bonds will raise a total of $185.7 billion, paying more than half the cost of the estimated cost of the war of $300 billion. You can't even get one aircraft carrier for that today. And that will work out to $2,000 in purchase of war bonds by every citizen in the US, when at that time the annual income was $2,000 a year. The USS Arizona was built in 1916. It was refitted in 1929 and totally overhauled in 1940. On the day of the attack of Pearl Harbor, it will take 4 direct hits. The 4th bomb is an armor-piercing bomb. It will go through 5 decks and hit a ammunition magazine, causing an instant explosion and literally splitting the ship in half and sinking. There will be 1,177 sailors killed, and only 335 will survive. Captain Vandenberg is killed instantly in the explosion. The youngest survivor is 16-year-old Robert Olson from Idaho, and he was at the mess hall having breakfast and was not on the ship. There'll be 37 pairs or trios of brothers on the Arizona when it is hit. Of the 79 brothers, 63 will be killed, including 23 pairs of brothers. The only pair of brothers to survive are Keith and Russell Warner. Keith is at the mess hall. Russell is on the ship and he's severely injured, but he will survive. There's one father-son pair on the ship, Thomas and August Free. They will both die. There's one set of twins, Delbert and John Anderson. John will survive. 3 sets of 3 brothers, 1 in each set will survive. Of the 63 brothers that are killed, only 4 bodies will be recovered. 59 will either be buried at sea or lost to sea. Following that attack, pairs of brothers are discouraged but not prohibited. And in June of 1942, the USS Sullivan will be attacked and sunk. And the 5 Sullivan brothers from Iowa City will all die. The 21-member band on the deck of the USS Arizona, they would be there to prepare for the raising of the flag, which they would do every day. Every member of the band will die. The day before the attack, on December 6th of 1941, the USS Arizona will take on 1.5 million gallons of fuel. In that attack and that explosion, much of it will either be burned or dissipated, but it still holds 500,000 gallons of fuel, which is seeping at a rate of 9 quarts a day. President Eisenhower, on May of 1958, will sign legislation to create a memorial of the Arizona and its sunken ship. The upper decks will be removed. Elvis Presley, on March 25th, 1961, will hold a benefit concert in Pearl Harbor to raise money to pay for this memorial. Ticket sales will be $52,000. Elvis and Colonel Parker will donate another $10,000 for a total of $62,000, which will pay for about 10% of the cost of the memorial. They will have a dedication on May 30th of 1962. The buried portion of the Arizona serves as the internment ground for over 1,000 sailors. In 1982, legislation was passed to allow any survivors to have their ashes interned in the Arizona. 44 have done so, the last in 2019. Over 1 million people will visit this memorial annually. Lou Contra of California is the last survivor of the USS Arizona, dying on April 22nd of 2024 at the age of 101. Admiral Yamamoto oversees all the operations of the Navy, architect and designer of many of the attacks that they will do. But he also is involved in the development of a new class of submarines called the I-400, which is appropriately named since these submarines are 400 feet long. They have 4 diesel engines and they can travel 1.5 times around the world without refueling. The plan was to use these to attack the east and west coast of the US and the Panama Canal to cut off passage from the east to the west. There were to be 18 of these submarines built, but only 3 ever got manufactured and only 2 ever got put into service. The first was commissioned on January 18th of 1943. You notice these are called carrier subs. They actually carried 3 airplanes. Now when you look at this submarine here, you kind of say, well, where are those airplanes? And we'll get to that in just a second. They had a plan in place that they would take these submarines and they would come off the coast of San Diego. They would launch the planes would fly over San Diego and drop bioweapons. And it was estimated that they would have killed tens of thousands of people. This attack was to take place in September of 1945. To our fortune, Japan surrenders in August 15th of 1945, and that attack never occurred. Well, here's our planes that the submarine would carry. They would be catapulted off of this ramp. They would fly out, drop their bombs. They would come back, land in the ocean. A crane would lift them back onto the submarine. The flotation devices could be removed, the wings could be removed, the tail sections could be folded, and they would be shoved into this tube. You can see them on the surface of, or the top level of the submarine. As I mentioned, they were 400 feet long. They were the largest submarines in the world at that time, and there would be none larger until 1963 or 65, when the US built the nuclear-powered Polaris submarine. Well, Janesville 99, the tank company out of Janesville, Wisconsin. It's a National Guard unit that was established in 1930 at the Armory here in Janesville, Wisconsin. In 1940, they are the 32nd Red Arrow Tank Company, and they will then merge and become part of the 192nd Tank Battalion. They will be shipped out to the Philippines on November 4th of 1941, and they will arrive on Thanksgiving Day. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. The next day, on December 8th of 1941, they attacked the Philippines, and they will destroy or damage essentially all of the aircraft that the US has on the ground, and they cannot mount a counterattack. But unlike Pearl Harbor, they will follow that attack with a land assault and a blockade around the island. They will go to war with the Allied forces. The Allied forces will be backed up to the tip of the Bataan Peninsula, and they will fight with the Japanese for 3 months. They will run out of supplies and food, and they will reach a point of starvation, and they will surrender to the Japanese on April 9th of 1942. The Japanese will capture 75,000 Allied forces. They will then begin to make them march 65 miles, and it will take anywhere from 5 to 12 days, depending on the condition of the forces. And they will be marching about 100 at a time. And they will march from the southern tip of the peninsula to a railroad station here at San Fernando. Once they reach San Fernando, they will be forced into boxcars that would hold about 40, and they will put as many as 60 into these boxes. Many will die simply from lack of oxygen. And there is no sanitation, and many will die from disease. Once they reach the other end of that railroad line at Capas, they will then march them to Camp O'Donnell, which will be a concentration camp. Of the 75,000 that are captured, only 54,000 will reach Camp O'Donnell. It is estimated that as many as 650 Americans and as many as 16,000 Philippine forces will not survive that march or that transportation to Camp O'Donnell. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa is the officer in charge of that death march and the concentration camps, and he will be charged with war crimes and be found guilty and executed on April 3rd of 1946. Here's some photos of that death march, that Bataan Death March, and you can see the huge number or large number of Allied forces that were forced to do this march. This is the burial patrol that are taking and burying the bodies. It's interesting if you go online and you start searching World War II history, you will find many, many, many photos and even videos and movies that the Japanese took during World War II. You can find videos taken from the Japanese planes on their attack of Pearl Harbor. I think the Japanese thought that they were going to win this war, and they were going to make sure they had a very large permanent collection to show generations forever the mighty power of the Japanese over that huge, powerful USA. Well, only 35 of the 99 will survive captivity. 2/3 of them will perish. and they will suffer torture, brutality, starvation, dehydration, disease, and murder. 2 will be killed in the attack. 1 will die in the death march. 1 will be killed at a concentration camp. 15 will die on unmarked Japanese POW ships that are sunk by Allied submarines or ships. There's a book here called Prisoners of War, and highlighted there is Forrest Knox of Janesville, who is one of the survivors of the Bataan Death March. The last known of the Janesville 99 is Lewis Wallace, who dies on October 7th of 2009 at the age of 88. There is a plaque outside of the Armory that tells a little bit about the Janesville 99 and their participation in the Bataan Death March. The Armory today is an event center, and it's actually a very nice one, and I'm familiar with it because that is where our daughter had her wedding reception. So I have been in that Armory, and you can just kind of sit there and visualize what it must have been like watching military drills in that Armory. And they also have a monument in downtown Janesville for those, the dead and living who fought at Bataan. The U.S. had a total of 142,227 American POWs combined in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. And while that seems like a pretty large number, it's relatively small compared to 3 million German POWs and 6 million Russian POWs. And of that number, 1,929 were Wisconsinites, and again, of that total, 15,190 will die in captivity. The interesting statistic is of that number, 3/4 of them died at the hands of the Japanese during World War II. As vicious as Germany was with their prisoners in their concentration camps, the Japanese were even worse. The Japanese will suffer 3.1 million deaths of military and civilians, 2.3 million for the military. What is interesting here is I just assume most of them died because of the war. But in fact, 2/3 of them actually died from starvation and disease. Well, we're going to now quickly talk about the nuclear bombs. And as many as the nuclear bombs killed in a single dropping of a bomb, it is not the most deadly number of people killed in a single bombing. That credit is given to Operation Meeting House over Tokyo, which happens on March 10th of 1945. Much of the construction of Tokyo is wood and parchment. On that date, there will be 300 B-29s, and they will pass over and drop 500,000 6-pound napalm bombs. And on explosion, they will spew flaming liquid that will attach itself to anything it comes in contact with and burn. It will create a heat tornado of 1,888 degrees, incinerating anything in its path. It will kill 100,000 civilians and leave 1 million homeless, and it will destroy 15.8 square miles of Tokyo. But Japan will not surrender. The Allied forces will continue to drop these bombs through April and May, destroying another 38.7 square miles of Tokyo. But Japan still will not surrender. President Truman now is considering using the nuclear bomb. The question is, why did we use that nuclear bomb? Well, he wanted to show the power of the US to the Japanese. And he knew that eventually the only way they were going to conquer Japan was to do a land assault, and he wanted to avoid that. It is estimated that by dropping the bombs, they will save up to 250,000 American lives and as many as 250,000 Japanese lives. The US has had a document called the Potsdam Declaration, in which they are requiring Japan to surrender unconditionally. The US will sign this declaration. Japan refuses to sign the declaration. The US also is now concerned about Russia. They don't initially sign on to the Potsdam Declaration, but they will later. And they are worried, the US is worried that the Russians will attack Japan and try to occupy Japan just like they did Germany. And the US does not want Russia to get to Japan first, and they do not want the spread of communism. So they want to end this as quickly as they can. While the war started in September of 1939, Japan has already started World War II prior to that. They, in 1937, have started attacking and conquering many nations in the South Pacific, including China, and they have conquered large chunks and portions of China. Russia has started a counterattack in the north of China, and they are heading south towards Japan. They will come to try to determine what targets to use the nuclear bombs on. They come up originally with 12 cities. They get it down to a list of 5. The number 1 target on their list is Hiroshima. And it is selected because it does not have a POW camp, so we don't have to worry about Allied forces. It has a large military force and military manufacturing, and it is in a valley that will enhance the effect of the nuclear bomb. And it is a community that has suffered little damage during the war, and they want such a community so they can see what the single effect of that one bomb will be. The second target was to be Kokura, and here they had a large munitions storage and manufacturing. When they did the dropping of the nuclear bombs, they didn't rely on radar, they relied on visual sight. And on the day that they passed over Kokura, they could not see their target. And so they swung south and they came right over the top of Nagasaki on their way back. And Nagasaki will get the second bomb. Nagasaki had a large base with a large shipyard, and Mitsubishi manufactured the 2 largest battleships that Japan had in this harbor. They thought about attacking Tokyo, but Tokyo had already received severe damage from those napalm bombs. And they wanted to make sure that the political government still was in existence so somebody could surrender and sign the treaty. So our first bomb is dropped on August 6th of 1942. Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr. is the pilot of the B-29. He names this plane after his mother, Enola Gay. This is a uranium bomb called Little Boy, and it has the explosive equivalency of 15,000 tons of TNT. But the bomb is actually very poor efficient. It doesn't work all that well. Only 1.3% of the uranium will actually undergo fission and explosion. Yet, it will destroy 5 square miles, and it will instantly kill 80,000. And it will end up with as many as 156,000 will die with burns, injuries, and radiation. And a study in 1998 said it could have been over 200,000. Japan still will not surrender. So, President Truman decides we will drop a second nuclear bomb over Nagasaki. And this happens on August 9th, 1945, in another B-29 called Boxcar. And this is a plutonium bomb. It has the explosive equivalency of 21,000 tons of TNT. And it's a little more efficient. This is 10 times more efficient, meaning about 14% of the uranium undergoes fission and explosion. And it will kill instantly up to 40,000 and as many as 70,000, again with burns, injuries, and radiation. Following these 2 drops of the nuclear bomb, Truman is very reluctant to drop another bomb because of the huge number of lives lost in those single droppings of those bombs. But Japan still will not surrender. And President Truman actually then does end up ordering another nuclear bomb to be dropped, and it was to be dropped on August 19th. They had already shipped the bomb to Tinian Island, from which they had launched the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was actually planned that they would have as many as 12 nuclear bombs that they would drop on Japan. Fortunately, they surrendered in August of 1945, and we did not ever have to drop any more nuclear bombs. Even after the dropping of the bomb at Nagasaki, the military leaders of Japan did not want to surrender. Hirohito, the emperor, has told the military leaders, start making battle plans indicating that we may surrender. On August 14th of 1945, he will make a pre-recorded record of surrender. The military leaders find out about this, and 1,000 of them will attack the palace looking for this record. They will not find it because it was carried out of the house in a basket having women's underwear. This record is called the Gyokuan Huso. And on August 15th of 1945, they will play this record in which Hirohito, the emperor, will announce their surrender unconditionally. This will be the very first time that many of the citizens of Japan will have ever heard the voice of the emperor. And he will agree to the terms of the Potsdam Declaration of unconditional surrender. I didn't quite know what the difference of that was. A conditional surrender means we'll surrender, but we are going to keep our government intact. An unconditional surrender means we give up everything, including our government. And so this is what we have at the end of World War II. Well, the headlines are screamed around the world of this surrender. We have celebration throughout the world, including the infamous kiss in Times Square. Now, remember, he surrenders on August 15th of 1945. The US is 15 hours behind Japan, so it is actually August 14th, 1945 here, but we celebrate it on the 15th. This photograph is known as the kiss. It was taken by Alfred Eisenstadt, who is a photographer for Life magazine. This is not a cover photo. It looks like it is, but it was not. It was in the Life edition of April 27th of 1945, and it was on page 27, and it was a full-page photo, including the magazine name of Life. Alfred Eisenstadt took 4 quick photos here, and it is supposed to be photo negative number 2. And I don't know if it's 2 from the top or 2 from the bottom. I believe it's number 2 from the top. Eisenstadt will have 90 of his photos on the cover of Life magazine, and his photos will appear in over 2,500 articles in Life magazine. While this one receives all the notoriety, there is actually a second photo taken, the exact same photo from a slightly different angle, and it was taken by naval photographer Victor Jorgensen. But it doesn't receive the notoriety because it's not published in a national magazine. Who are these people in this photo? The sailor is George Mendoza. He's 23 years old. He's on a 30-day leave from his ship in California. He has 2 days left on his leave. He's on a date with Rita Petrie, who's 20 years old, and she is a nurse. They are at a theater when the surrender is announced, and they join the throng in jubilation, stopping at a few places to have a drink along the way. They get to Times Square. George sees Greta Zimmer, a nurse, and he grabs her and gives her a kiss. Now, she's always referred to as a nurse, but she is not a nurse. She's actually a dental assistant, and dental assistants at that time dressed as nurses. The reason he said he grabs Greta and gives her the kiss is because he said on his ship, when it was attacked and badly damaged, and many of the sailors were injured, the nurses on the ship did a valiant job of saving the lives of many of those sailors. And therefore, he's always been very proud of their service. And he sees Greta dressed as a nurse, and he grabs her and gives the kiss. George and Rita will go on to continue to date. They will marry. They will be married for 69 years. Here's George when he's 95 years old, celebrating his birthday. And he must have died shortly after this because he died at the age of 95. Neither George nor Greta ever saw that photo when it was first published. In 1980 would be the first time that they will see the photo, because Life magazine, at the time the photo was taken, we don't know who the sailor is and we don't know who the nurse is. and they are going to do an investigation to try and identify who these people are. As many as 11 sailors and three nurses will claim to be the individuals in this photo. And in fact, if you go out and search the internet, you will find other photos of sailors and nurses kissing in different locations. So I could understand where some of them may have thought that was them. But through a forensic identification, they'll identify George because in the photo you can see his tattoo, GM, his initials, and some scars. And in addition, in the photo you see here the girlfriend, Rita. And they will also identify then Greta. And they will reproduce, they will go back to New York's Times Square and reproduce that kiss. That kiss is memorialized in a monument that was put in San Diego Harbor in 2007 called Unconditional Surrender. It's a foam statue and it didn't wear very well and eventually was put into storage. And then in 2013, they will create a bronze casting of this statue, and they will call it Embracing Peace. And they will put it in Tuna Harbor in San Diego in front of the USS Midway. That statue is 25 feet tall and weighs 15,000 pounds. The USS Midway is now a museum. At the time, it was the largest battle aircraft carrier in the US, and it was the last aircraft carrier commissioned in World War II. And it would remain the largest until 1955, and it was the first US aircraft carrier not to fit in the Panama Canal. I had the good fortune of being in San Diego and seeing the original monument and touring the USS Midway. You cannot fathom the size of these aircraft carriers until you walk the deck of one of those ships. And this ship will carry 3,000 sailors during the war. And while I was there at San Diego, the USS aircraft carrier, the Reagan, comes in. And at that time now, it is the largest aircraft carrier. And they are coming in and docking, and we watched 5,500 to 6,000 sailors fleeing out of that ship. It looked like a small community coming out of that ship. Well, the instrument of surrender was to be signed on August 31st of 1945, but because of bad weather, it gets postponed until September 2nd of 1945. And the signing is done on the USS Missouri. The USS Missouri is the last battleship to be commissioned during World War II, being commissioned in June of 1944. Some people asked, did they do the signing on the Missouri because President Truman was from Lamar, Missouri? No, not really. The Missouri was selected because it was already in Tokyo Harbor, and it was the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. When we do this signing, MacArthur does everything he can to embarrass and put down Japan. A battleship in foreign water is considered to be a sovereign nation. He will make the Japanese the officials come through the harbor going past every sovereign nation, basically surrendering to every nation as they come into the harbor. He will not give them any military respect or honors. There will be no salutes. And the ceremony will be very short and will only last 20 minutes. There'll be 2 documents signed, one in English, one in Japanese. Here's President Truman with those 2 copies. Well, the war is over for most people, but not all the soldiers of Japan know that the war has ended, and many of them will continue to go on and fight after that signing of the surrender. The last 2 Japanese soldiers to surrender are Hiro Odana and Tera Nakamura. Onada is on Lubang Island, which is an island off the Philippines. That island will be attacked by the Allies in February of 1945 and quickly overrun. Onada, along with 3 other soldiers, will run into the jungle and continue to fight the war, attacking Philippine soldiers and civilians, and they will end up killing as many as 30 civilians. In 1950, one of those 4 will surrender. In 1954, one of them will be killed by a citizen in an effort to capture these these soldiers. And in 1972, the police will kill a third one. Onoda continues to escape. I don't know why he's the one who keeps getting away and going into the jungle and fighting. There's a young adventurer in Japan, and he travels around the world, and one of his missions is to go to Lubang Island and find and talk to Onoda, and he does that. He finds him, and he asks, "Why won't you surrender?" And he says, "I cannot surrender until I am commanded to do so." So the adventurer will go back to Japan and find his commander, Major Taniguchi, and he will take Taniguchi to Lubang Island, and Taniguchi will order Onoda to surrender. And he will do that at the age of 52 on March 9th of 1974, surrendering his sword to the Philippine President Marcos. He's not the last to surrender. The last to do so is Nakamura. He's on the Morotai Island, which is an Indonesian island. Again, the Allied forces will attack in 1945 and easily conquer the island. Nakamura is one of 12 that runs off into the jungle. In 1956, he will separate himself from those other 12. They don't give a good reason why he does that. Apparently there was some disagreement and dispute. And basically, he's just going into the jungle and surviving. In November of 1974, the Japanese government is notified that there's still a living soldier on this island. And the government officials will show up in December 18th of 1974, and at the age of 55, Nakamura will surrender. Notice in this photo, when Onoda surrenders, he's still wearing his uniform 29 years later. When Nakamura surrenders, as I mentioned, he's just barely surviving. He has no clothes. He's naked at this point. And when both of them return to their homeland, they can't fit in because things have changed so much over that period of 29 years. So our war is now officially done and over. But I want to finish up with one last story. As I want to tell you about Calvin Graham, who is the youngest to serve in World War II. Calvin is 12 years old. He wants to serve in the Navy. He gets a friend of his to forge his mother's signature for permission. He steals a stamp to stamp his papers, and he puts down that he is 17 years old. He's worried about the physical because he thinks the dentist will say that he is only 12 years old. And indeed, the dentist says, "You are only 12 years old." And he insists he is 17. And they will go back and forth and argue. And finally, Calvin will say, "You know, you just let through these two guys ahead of me. And I know they were 14 and 15. The dentist has had enough." He says, "Fine." And he walks away. And so on August 15th of 1942, he is sworn into the Navy at the age of 12. He is on the USS Dakota. His ship is attacked. He is seriously injured, falls down 3 flights of stairs, but he will assist in the recovery of other injured sailors, and he will sit with them through the night to make sure they recover. And he will be honored with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. However, his mother now finds out what he's been up to, and she reports to the Navy that he is only 13 years old. They don't dismiss him, they throw him in the brig. His sister then writes a letter to the Navy and says, "You will have to release my brother, or I will report to the papers that you are holding a baby war hero." And so they do discharge him, but they give him a dishonorable discharge. He's not a normal 13-year-old now. He doesn't fit into society. He's been in an adult world. He's been through a war. By the age of 14, he is married and he has a child. By the age of 17, he is divorced and he joins the Marines. 3 years later, he will fall off a pier and injure his back. He will not be able to collect disability because he has a dishonorable discharge. He will fight for the rest of his life to get back his medals and his medical disability. President Carter will sign legislation restoring his medals except for the Purple Heart. President Reagan will sign legislation giving him back his medical disability, which will be $8,100, but he can only produce receipts for $2,100, and that is all he will receive. He will die on November 6th of 1992 at the age of 62. He will be given an honorable military burial, and his family after that burial will receive his Purple Heart. So Calvin Graham, is the youngest to serve in a war since the Civil War. I thought it was quite an interesting story about somebody who served during that time. Well, that brings me to the end of our presentation on VJ Day. There's a lot more you could learn and a lot more we could tell. Another really big one I would have initially included, but I didn't have time, was the Battle of Midway, in which again now what was his name now? Yakimo. Anyhow, he was in charge of that battle, and the plan was he was going to sneak in to Midway, the island Midway, with his 6 aircraft carriers. I think he had 4 aircraft carriers, and surprise the American forces and try to destroy the aircraft carriers in Midway so they could not mount an air attack on Japan. What he didn't know was we had cracked the code and we knew they were coming. So we did a surprise attack on them, and we sunk all 4 of their aircraft carriers. And that pretty much opened the floodgates to allow the Allied forces to then attack Japan. So there's a lot of interesting information. So, yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. The guy that was captured, the Japanese guy.
Sakamaki?
And brought to Camp McCoy. Did he stay there for the war then, or was he?
No, he did not. He stayed there for most of it. And then what they ended up doing with Sakamaki, and this is kind of interesting thing that I found later in my research, they actually had him go to different POW camps that had Japanese POWs in an effort for him to try and persuade them that they should not commit suicide. So they used him to do that purpose. So he did end up going to other POW camps. He didn't spend the whole time here in Wisconsin.
But he was here for a while.
I'm sorry?
But he was here for a while.
Yeah, probably the majority of the time. Because initially, Camp McCoy had all Japanese POWs to begin with, until they couldn't take any more. They had up to 3,500 Japanese POWs, until they couldn't take any more, and then they opened a second camp in Iowa, and then after that, they started putting them in other locations as well. The interesting thing about that was, and I always wondered, why did they put them in Camp McCoy to begin with? Because it's about as far from either coast as you could get, and it's about as far north as you could get. And the only conclusion I could come to, there was never an explanation, is that because of the fear of that code of conduct that says you fight to the death, they were so concerned about what may happen if they were to escape and what they would do to civilians. So they got them about as far from either coast as they could, so they would never be able to escape. I'm doing research on a new presentation that will be called Untold, Unheard, and Unusual World War II Stories. And these are stories that I never, in many cases, I'd never have heard of these. I didn't know Australia had been attacked by Japan during the war. I knew that Australia fought with the British as part of the Ally, but I didn't know that their island had actually been attacked. Remember, we talked about all these POWs, and there were over 2,300 that escaped, but most of them were caught. But at the end of the war, there were 12 POW fugitives that the FBI now went looking for. J. Edgar Hoover sent his FBI's. He was going to catch all these. They did catch one in 1954 in Mexico. They caught one in 1954 in Europe. They caught one in 1959 who surrendered to the authorities in Chicago. The story that I will tell you is about George Gartner is his name, and he escaped from a POW camp in Arizona in 1945 because he knew that when Germany surrendered, he knew what his fate was going to be. He was going to be sent home, and his home was in territory that had been conquered by Russia. And he knew that if he was sent back to that country, At best, he'd be put into a prison. At worst, he'd be executed. So he decided he had to escape, and he did. And he basically remained undercover, out in the open, for 40 years. And he was the last of Hitler's soldiers to surrender and turn himself in 40 years later. So stories like that, and there's a number of unusual stories that I find quite interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, I always just said the reason Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor was for oil. And to your point earlier, they were in war with China in '37, and Japan's very natural resource poor.
Right.
Most wars are started because of natural resources.
Right.
And
That was.
they had to have oil.
Yeah.
They were hoping
Right.
that we could come to some agreement, or we would say, fine, take your oil, we want to go home,
Right.
and pretend this never happened. And of course, it
Yeah.
didn't happen.
Right.
But they were after the oil. That
Yep.
was, they didn't, I don't want to say they didn't care about the United States. They wanted China.
Right.
That was their goal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They were in their way.
Well, that was the whole purpose of doing many of those nations in the South Pacific. Japan isn't that big. They don't have a lot of their resources, as you said. The primary one is oil, but they were looking for other resources as well. That's where, once the U.S., they would not sign the Potsdam Declaration, and the U.S. said, fine, we're going to put up a blockade. Now they are in a critical situation. How are we going to survive? Because we need to rely on that oil from China and the Pacific nations. And that's when they decided they had to declare war.
Yeah, and the other point too is the unconditional surrender point. You probably read, there's been a lot of research lately that said,
Right,
Roosevelt said early in the war, unconditional surrender.
right,
And Japan heard that loud and clear. And as the war went on, they kind of wanted to give up. There were people within the Japanese government, a lot of them, that would have maybe signed a treaty with us
Sure.
before we had to drop the bombs.
sure,
But the unconditional surrender scared the pants off.
yeah,
And that's one of the major reasons they would not surrender. Plus, as you said, the political problems in Japan were
right,
atrocious.
right,
But yeah, that's the unconditional surrender is interesting because,
yeah,
as you said, Truman wanted to drop the bombs at places we had not bombed because they didn't know what was going to happen.
right, right. Oh, yeah, it's something brand new. They knew that there was a potential for doing great damage. They just didn't know what that damage would be.
Happens. Today we make all these great war things.
Right,
And we want to use them. And
Right.
you can't use them unless you got a war.
right. Well, we actually
Go
had,
to Afghanistan. We're going to go to places.
yeah, we actually had 3 nuclear bombs. The first was a combination uranium-plutonium. That was the one that was dropped in New Mexico as a test.
correct.
And these were the second and third nuclear bombs. And then the question is, do we have enough to actually do another nuclear bomb? And we did. We had enough stock that we could have done eventually up to 12 more bombs. Yeah,
But Truman's an interesting guy. You hit on this too, with his remorse over that. And
yeah,
that troubled him the rest of his life. He's
Yeah.
an interesting man.
yeah. Yeah, it was a fascinating research and I enjoyed it. So,
Yeah.
well, okay, we'll bring that to an end. And I thank you all for showing up and putting up with my presentation. Yeah.
Did you want to say a little bit about this presentation?
Sure,
You know?
sure. Sometime down the road here, I will come. I've started this presentation now, so it's in my rotation. But many of you have probably seen CSI. And in CSI, they will process a crime scene, analyze the evidence, and convict somebody in a court of law all in 1 hour. And that's not reality. So what I will do is I will tell you the reality of forensic science. So I will define what forensic science is, what a forensic scientist is, and I will tell you what forensic services are provided by the Wisconsin crime labs. And then I will share with you the experience of a 34-year forensic analyst and some of the unusual drug cases that he analyzed and crime scenes that he participated in. And that experienced analyst is me. I spent 34 years with the crime lab here in Madison, Wisconsin. And between crime scenes and autopsies, I processed somewhere around 150 bodies. So I've seen about every way you could kill somebody. And I tell people, if you want to see the gory details of a crime scene, watch CSI on TV or Ion Mysteries. The purpose of my presentation in the crime scenes, there will be nothing graphic. I'm simply showing you, setting up what the scene looked like. and probably the people who were involved in that and how he went about getting those individuals for those crime scenes and what happened to them. And all of the crime scenes I will talk about, I participated in while I was in the lab, except for the very first one. And that one happened in 1957. It is probably the most notorious homicide in Wisconsin, and that is the Ed Gein case. Maybe you know something about Ed Gein. He's considered the butcher of Plainfield. And his story is the basis of the book Psycho, written by Robert Bloch, not me, with a different spelling, it's C-H. And that book is the basis of Alfred Hitchcock's movie, The Cycle. So you'll learn something about that crime scene and some information about Ed Gein. So I think it'll be an interesting and enjoyable, let's make it more interesting and informative presentation. And it's kind of entertaining in that, like I said, it's nothing graphic. So yeah, so that'll be coming up probably sometime next year here. So.
Thank you, Bob.
All right, you bet. You all have a good night.